All right. Good day. Welcome to the Rational Standard Podcast. I am your host, David Ansara. I have wrestled the hosting duties away from Martin van Staden, who joins us, I guess, as the star of the show today, because this week Martin launched a very important paper for the Free Market Foundation. It was called Constitutional Land Reform Alternatives to Confiscation and Retribution. And yeah, I think we got some good engagement with that. We had a formal launch that you can check out on the FMF channel. But it turns out that we at the Free Market Foundation really like property rights. Who would have thought? And we're not that happy that the state is trying to dilute private property rights. So we thought that we would do what think tanks do best and put out a paper expressing our concerns and articulating an alternative as well to the Expropriation Act, which we think needlessly dilutes that very sacred and important principle of private property rights protections. And I think Martin, in the talk and in the paper itself, you outline that actually Section 25 of the Constitution makes quite extensive provisions for the protection of private property rights, and actually the Free Market Foundation played a big role during the 1990s in the transitional negotiations, articulating the case for private property rights. So we like to claim at least some credit for influencing the discourse during that period, and trying to lobby politicians to see that benefit. But this is even more extensive than, say, in the United States, where there's kind of passing reference in their constitution to private property. That they just make provision for compensation. And I think the big takeaway that I took from your paper was that really the Section 25 is about empowering citizens to become owners. And it's not about empowering the state to have more authority over who gets what piece of property, when and how. And really, it's about understanding that our historical context informs the fact that we should be extremely strict and narrow in terms of what powers we give to the state. Because if any country has experience with violating private property rights at scale, it's South Africa. So we should, in order to correct those historical injustices, we should be tightening up and strengthening private property rights. And where there is a claim made against the state for those historical abuses, that claim should be acknowledged and fulfilled by the state. And I think the big fallacy that is often being made here in the public debate is conflating redistribution with restitution. Restitution is important, and that should be a priority in terms of public policy and in terms of state resources and how those are allocated. But that doesn't mean that we should be seizing the private property of people who are not responsible for those past wrongs. So yeah, Martin, talk us through the paper. This is not a formal paper launch, but what are some of the ethos that underpinned your writing here?
Yeah, so thanks, David. Yeah, I think we encourage everyone to go and watch the formal launch. There, it's kind of a more kind of beat by beat analysis or kind of explanation of the paper. I think this is a good opportunity to get more into some of the background things that were being considered, and I think you alluded to something important there, and that is how you read a constitution and our constitution is often more important than what the Constitution itself provides. So in the United States, there is, I think, just one reference to private property rights. That is, I'm speaking under correction now, I should know this. I think it's the 15th Amendment. I think there is, as part of a kind of a provision that provides for due process of law, it says that no one will be deprived of property without due process of law and upon the payment of just compensation. And that's it. But Americans, and I have kind of the American legal community in mind here, kind of from the start, people like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, various Supreme Court justices, over generations, when they read that, they don't just see, oh, well, okay, so the Constitution only references private property passively, therefore it doesn't really matter. No, the way that they approach reading their Constitution has had the effect of making private property a key principle of their whole constitutional order. If you listen to Americans talking about the right to property in their country, in their constitutional discourse, you would imagine that the US Constitution is just filled with protection after protection for property rights, when it simply is not. So, how you read it and what you have in the back of your mind when you read a Constitution is almost more important than what the Constitution itself provides. So now in South Africa, we have Section 25 of the Constitution, which, if you read it, it's, in my view, very good. It's very clear about, it's very strict about you may not be deprived of your property without kind of due process, a law of general application. It sets out that the government may expropriate, but this is a limited power. This is not something that the government can just willy-nilly do. It sets out that there is an acknowledgement of our past of dispossession, and that we cannot just let this lie. Something has to be done to correct this, and it does it in a pro-property manner. It effectively says that the government must foster conditions that enable more South Africans to become owners of private property. It dedicates the government to the restitution of stolen property. It dedicates the government to securing insecure tenure, such an important thing, to going where people's ownership is in question. And it tells the government, you must take it out of question. It must be strong and secure ownership. That's what the Constitution says. And then people read this. They read this strict protection for private property, and they say, oh no, this is just a power for the state to kind of violate property rights as it wants. So therefore that's fine. And our courts have participated in this. Our legal jurists, our legal scholars have participated in this. How they read the Constitution matters more than what the Constitution says. And that is a big part of what this paper does. It takes each dimension, let's say, of Section 25, security of kind of property, expanding ownership, and restorative justice. And it says, look, this is what the Constitution says. And if you read it as if it is a Constitution, which you should, as if it is part of a Bill of Rights, as it is, and as you should, then you would understand that this is how it works. In every part of this paper, I say that, well, people in the discourse interpret it this way, and this is why it is wrong. And that's very important, because our whole discourse around land reform, it's not really about okay, there's an injustice, we have to restore, fix the injustice, and go happily and merrily into the night. It is, oh, there was an injustice, but you know what we should do? We should give Cyril Ramaphosa unlimited power. That's kind of the essence of our land reform discourse. It's such a bizarre thing, which I think when someone realizes that trick, everything is going to start looking very weird to them. Like, yes, there is injustice. The Constitution tells us how to fix the injustice. The government could have done that immediately after the end of apartheid. It could have done it very quickly after the end of apartheid. But no, we're still 25, it's 2025, more than 30 years later. We're still having these same old conversations that actually just come down to the state saying, we don't like private property. We as the state want to acquire a lot of property and then lease it out to people kind of on an arbitrary whim. And if we don't, if our comrade wants that land, then we'll kick off the lessee because he's not an owner, and we'll kind of give it to our buddy. That is the actual conversation that we're currently having. That is what the Expropriation Act is. And that is not just the Expropriation Act. There's the Land Court Act. There's the misnamed Protection of Investment Act. There's the various acts that nationalized mineral resources, water, petroleum. I mean, none of this you can say is about righting the wrongs of the past. If it was, then we would say, okay, cool, here's a dam. It's a water resource. 400 years ago, there was a tribe that kind of homesteaded this dam, and the government came in the 1920s and took the dam from them. Okay, cool. We're righting the wrongs of the past. Here's the dam. there's the tribe. Hello, tribe. We're incorporating you as a legal entity. Here's the dam. You're now the owners. Cool. That would be righting the wrongs of apartheid. No. What did we do? We said, no. All the water in the country is now. Oh no, the state doesn't own it. The state is the trustee of all the water, which means the state owns the water, and that has led to rent seeking. That has led to abuse, not just in water but in minerals. Our mining industry has suffered. Petroleum. It's become very racialized. You cannot really invest in it without playing racial bean counting games with the government, and they want to extend this eventually to agricultural land. We've seen this idea already of they want to maybe not go the EFF route of saying, oh, the state is the custodian of all land. I'm sure they're going to want to start with saying, well, the state is the custodian of agricultural land, which is the Minister of Agriculture recently signed a bill, sent it to a bill with the president. The Preservation of Agricultural Land Act, I think is its name. It effectively comes down to the state is the custodian of all agricultural land. It doesn't go quite as far as to say it like the other pieces of nationalizing legislation, but we can see that trend, and it all goes against what the Constitution provides, and it goes against how we should read the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't imply, it doesn't say, it doesn't hint at that the state must be this landlord kind of that we all kind of have to ask for permission from. None of that. I mean, I would want to dare anyone to show me the provision in the Constitution that says that, and then I will give that person a lesson in English, because we cannot stretch these words beyond what they can bear according to their ordinary meaning. So yeah, that's kind of a long story, but it comes down to the Expropriation Act was not an inevitability. It wasn't something that, oh God, yes, we've had this constitution that's for so long hinted at this, and we just haven't really gotten around to doing it. So now finally, deliverance has arrived, and now we have the Expropriation Act after much struggle. No, the Expropriation Act is a political contrivance, very politically expedient, very politically convenient, but there is nothing that says that this is how it should have been. And the discourse over many years have readied the ground for this. And actually, the Constitution sets out very neatly, very clearly, in my view, how to do land reform in a way that recognizes the injustices of the past while respecting private property rights. I mean, this is so crucial. Like, there is no tension here. People always like pretending that, well, we have to choose, protecting property meaning protecting privilege, and restoring justice meaning confiscation. No. Like, these two things are not in tension with each other. Protecting property means restoring property that has been unlawfully taken and illegitimately taken. That is part of the whole kind of conception of property rights in the classically liberal, libertarian, even in certain conservative conceptions of property rights. But our socialist opponents have been ingenious. They have latched onto kind of a part of this and pretended like, no, socialists are actually the defenders of property. We as socialists want to restore to people what has been taken from them. No, they want to restore to the state what has never been its ever, and to what it has never been entitled to ever. And I think, and I hope this is a first step in kind of bringing a little bit more sense to that discourse. And I just want to thank our partners. This is part of our Liberty First initiative at the Free Market Foundation, and it's generously funded by the Atlas Network, for enabling us to do this, not just in the area of land reform, but we're going to do this in the area of trade and size of government and so forth in the future as well. But this is an important conversation to be had, because I think the moment we start just reading the Constitution appropriately, a lot of our problems will actually be easily solved. And it doesn't have to start with the government. It actually starts with ordinary South Africans not allowing themselves to be so easily misled.
Yeah, absolutely, Martin. Thanks a lot for that. And speaking of the Atlas Network, Zakhele and I were at the African Liberty Forum last week in Nairobi. That's why we were absent from the pod. So please excuse us, dear listeners, for reneging on our responsibilities to you and gallivanting around sub-Saharan Africa. But yeah, Zex and I will share some reflections on that in a little bit later on the pod. But Zex, thanks for joining. What's your perspective on this? How do we go about dealing with land reform without empowering the state to confiscate our land?
Yeah. Greetings to everyone. I'm still operating on East African time, apparently. So yeah, but yeah, concerning Martin's paper, great paper by the way, Martin. It was pretty, good to read. Of course, we are biased. We usually we share the same conception of property rights, although we may probably have, very fervent disagreements in the edges of it. But the general principle of it really. I tend to disagree with the perspective you contended. Particularly for me, really, is in the strengthening of, you know, institutions like the land claims court and things like that, because their apparent weakness, really, if you look at it, as you said, this is a political game, and it becomes apparent when you see the actual funding and seriousness that is given to these institutions that already exist, that ought to be the ones facilitating what you rightly point out as justice, right? Because there's a sleight of hand that is being done here. The South African state committed an injustice against, indigenous people in South Africa by confiscating their property. And equally, they are saying that for justice to be done, the very same South African state, we must add, the South African state just, now being controlled by the likes of, the ANC and their partners, must be the ones who facilitate justice, and their facilitation of justice is them owning what they originally confiscated. And that, of course, does not make sense. But that is the conversation that a lot of people really tend to, promote and acquiesce to. And I disagree with it. I disagree with it for particularly the reasons you mentioned, like, in different areas outside of, like, land thought of is always should always be thought of as, as capital. And we see this. I have been following, I think, for the past couple of years, really, up until the case ended up in the courts, the community of Kolobeni, and how they, due to the state owning their mineral rights, the state could sanction off and give mining rights to land that they were ancestrally connected to and did not specifically want mining to take place there. And, they fought this, but all of that was legal. The general principle is that currently all the minerals are owned by the state, and the state can, if a community does not want mining, decide to issue a mining right. If a community does want mining, the state can decide not to issue a mining right. And, that power is the power that ultimately is being, proposed to be given to politicians every time the issue of expropriation is spoken about, because expropriation is like, it's a legal concept that exists all across the world. But in South Africa, it is being used in the most insidious of manner, whereby they are trying to give the state unlimited powers to confiscate your property without any recourse. And a lot of people, of course, when you think that, the state is acting on your side, you would think, yeah, great, let them punish those people. Those people ought to definitely get punished. They deserve to get punished. And you'd be like, it's okay, it's okay. And then you look at, other states that have done this. It doesn't, like, the politician never stops, like, okay, we've punished enough people now. Just gonna relinquish all this power, give it all back to you. That never happens. The politicians will keep the power. And we see this in other African states. I was fortunate, I was writing a paper actually about property rights, and how I was arguing for a property rights centered legal order. And if you look at things like the property rights index, Africa suffers from a lack of strong private property protections, even in jurisdictions which you might think have pretty much solved the, historical injustice problem that South Africa is still at least saying that it is grappling with. But I don't think we are taking seriously the problem given our responses to it. But in all these African states, similar powers exist whereby the state can come and confiscate people's property, and the implications of that are detrimental. Right? It is part of the reason why a majority of the world's poor people still reside in Africa. It is a very unfortunate statistic that none of our politicians are taking seriously. And in my paper, I argue that really the solution is simple: have strong private property protections, and that includes not having legislation that allows you to, confiscate people's property without compensating them. Like this should be a bare minimum. This should be a bare minimum, because the effects thereof, right? Let's say the legislation is implemented, and 10 to 20 years down the line they decide to, repeal it. The confidence, right? Because all of this is psychological in human beings. Even you domestically, you won't have confidence that the state has changed. Therefore, this impacts the amount of investment you will make if you do have the capital. If you are, based in a foreign country, do you even come back? These are things that, for instance, Zimbabwe is dealing with, right? Zimbabwe has tried by all means to institute reforms, but still it is suffering the perception of, a property injustice that was done. And even though they're trying to correct that, perception, it is a very difficult thing to do. And of course, their government still has the same problems that any African government does. So I don't think people realize the effects of it, right? Irrespective of the good argument you made, Martin, that the justice aspect of it is not what is being discussed. Because if that was the case, then in your example, there would be like, here's property, and here's person A or community A, or whatever entity really that was dispossessed, and they would give it to that person. But their solution is that the state gets to take that. And we see that even in previous expropriation cases, whereby the state will take the land and then lease it back to the people, which I think is something that should not be promoted under any circumstances. But especially us, given the problems that we know our politicians have, we can talk the whole day about the amount of problems and the abuses of power that they're already getting up to without the unlimited power to take people's property. So yeah, and the justice aspects of it can easily be dealt with whilst protecting private property. You make a very good point. Justice, the injustice of having property confiscated from you is fundamentally premised on the right to said property rights. And I think when you eliminate the person who is supposed to enjoy that justice, or whatever entity is supposed to enjoy that justice, and replace it with a state, worst of all, the state that committed the original injustice in most cases than not, then I think you are losing the plot entirely. But I'm a legal eagle, for lack of a better term. So such things to me, matter really. How, as you said, a normal use of word should be respected, and basic principles like property, irrespective of their consequences, really, which are always good when they are protected. That is property rights. But I think in South Africa we should not lose sight the fact that even though the well has been poisoned, I guess papers like yours help in showing that the justice argument is not being had. So let's at the very least have that justice argument. Let's not just limit the end of justice being the state owning everyone's property, which is unfathomable, which is unfathomable for many reasons. So yeah, that is pretty much my view.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Zach. So, I mean, I think ultimately this all boils down to power, and there's a reason why the state wants to limit people's private property rights, because they, I think, implicitly understand that that is a domain that is outside of their control. This proliferation and diffusion of power across society, reinforced by a private property rights framework, that is a way in which we as citizens can actually hold government to account. We can resist state power. And I mean, I had a really interesting conversation with Anthea Jeffrey of the Institute of Race Relations. He's the head of policy research there. And you can check that out on the FMF channel. I mean, we were just looking at the mining industry. I think a lot of people don't fully understand the ways in which regulatory takings have occurred in the mining industry, that effectively through state decree, the mineral rights that once belonged to mining companies were essentially seized by the state through the Agri-SA case. You guys are the legal eagles, so you'd be able to explain to our listeners a bit more about how that actually occurred. But, essentially the Constitutional Court ratified that decision by the government and used arguments of transformation, and that the state is the kind of custodian of the natural mineral rights of the country, and that this is all fine. And I think that's really should be a cautionary tale, that the state exercised that regulatory power and essentially rug pulled an entire industry. And now, as as Martin has pointed out, has also done that in terms of water resources as well, and is now trying to do that in terms of private property. And even in a context where you have a state that has some kind of duty to the public good and is fairly well managed and administered, we would still say that this is a power that we would not want a well managed government like in Denmark or Switzerland or wherever to have. This is a slippery slope that once you get onto it is very hard to get off of. And so when you have private property, it's not just the roof over your head. It's your domain. You extend your sovereignty that you have over yourself to your home or your property or your farm, and that gives you real tangible power. That phrase that we often see on the doors of restaurants or bars or wherever, right of admission reserved, that means something. Like, you have a right over that space, and other people can't exercise their power over you. I mean, I always find it interesting. We'll reflect on Africa Liberty Forum, but whenever we go to these conferences in other African countries, which is a great privilege, often what strikes me in the hotels, and anytime you go to a store or something, you will see a portrait of the president hanging in the lobby, and that's actually something that you don't really see in South Africa, apart from in government departments or wherever. But it always strikes me as a kind of an unusual feature, like, oh, hey, actually the state has dominion over this hotel. It might be branded with the logo of a foreign hotel group, but and even when I was in the hotel in Nairobi, as I was coming back from the gym one morning, there was a scene with all of these like very important looking politicians who were gathered in a small little room, and wearing their gray suits, and there were security guards outside with like policemen with like military fatigues on. There was a bit of a stir in the lobby, and I thought, this is very weird. So I asked the concierge, like, what's going on here? And he said to me smilingly, said, "Oh no, they're just making sure that you're safe here at the hotel, and that the safety of the guests is ensured." I don't know what the actual reason was, but it seemed, it was just like a little bit of an ominous kind of vibe about it. And I think we should take our private domain seriously. And just because you have an elected government doesn't mean they have a right to use your property or come onto your property, and let alone take your property. So I think that that's really important. It's like, a government is an elected representative body. It's not the sovereign dominator of the citizens. There's a social contract there, and they have to uphold their side of the social contract. Martin?
Let me just fix my camera here. Yeah, you make a very important point there, David. There is an age-old distinction in law between the private and the public. And that distinction is not just a formalistic kind of way to categorize certain legal measures and institutions. It's a matter of substance. The public is where we have our elections and we choose who governs the country, and that's where democracy lives. The private, that is where the absolute is a strong word, where the sovereignty and the autonomy and the privacy and the exclusionary right of an individual and a community and a business lives. And this is something that is understood in what we would call the open and democratic societies of the world. You mentioned Denmark and so on, but you can include even like Singapore, which is to some degree a dictatorship, but they actually they understand what private property means. That is why when you look at the Singaporean Land Authority's website, like the first thing you see when you inquire about how does expropriation work in Singapore, you see that they say, yes, we have the Land Acquisition Act, and it represents a very severe deprivation of a property owner's property. And we as the government really just want to stand by the owner every step of the way, and we're going to make sure they get their complete just compensation for the property, market related compensation. We're going to make sure there's no disruptions, and that there's a high degree of deference to them. And you see this everywhere in the open and democratic societies of the world, because there is a way to make that private into the public. That's expropriation. That's expropriation law. It's a strict process. It's a limited process that the government can only do at a big cost to itself, and following very strict procedures that have developed into international best practice. In Africa, politicians don't like this. They do not like that. They find that intensely problematic. In Africa, maybe some places in South America and Asia as well. But this to them is a big problem. And you described how it works in the rest of Africa, and the South African government wants that as well. And a very recent example, I think from April, I have mentioned it before, but I'm always going to mention it. Buffalo City, East London. There was some pastor there who is contentious for some reason. He did something wrong, apparently. He went to court, but he was acquitted. Now, the judge wasn't happy to acquit him. The judge said that the prosecutors made a shitty case of it. The point is, he was acquitted. Done. It's over. Like, cry a river. It's over now. After he was acquitted, the Buffalo City municipality, which owns, for some reason that only God himself will be able to tell us why, Buffalo City owns a theater hall. This is a government institution that owns a theater hall. Now, this pastor had booked this theater hall for one of his services, and everything was kind of ready. And then after the acquittal, there was a big public backlash. And the mayor said, okay, no, we're canceling the booking. We won't stand for this. So think about that for a moment. And there's other examples of this also happening. This is the government, the ANC basically, saying that we see what is happening in Tanzania, in Kenya, in Nigeria, and we also want that. We also want the ability to pull the rug from under civic events, commercial events, things that are happening in our midst. We want the power of veto over all of it. In the free world, that does not exist. Once that pastor or whoever else is the contentious person steps over the dividing line of public property and private property, they are now they're untouchable. Unless you're the police and you're exercising a police power of pursuit and kind of having to arrest them for something. But unless they're guilty of some kind of crime, they are now untouchable. The ANC does not want that. They do not like that idea. When civic society has events in big conference centers where it's said that the ANC is bad and so on, I think the ANC would very much like to be able to cancel those events itself. To say, hey, cancel that event. We own the property. We're the ultimate custodian of all land in the country. So we're not going to stand for that, because that is the power that I think, with maybe two or three exceptions, every government on this continent has. And that is why every time we speak to our colleagues on the continent and ask them, so why haven't you done this, that, and the other thing, they say, well, we can't, because it doesn't matter where we go in the country. That is where the government has the legal right to stop us. And we experience this every time we go up into Africa. Very kind of invasive questioning that I've experienced at the airports about, hey, what are you doing here, and kind of where are you going, and my colleagues from the continent saying, hey, just don't tell them you're going to anything political. If you say you're going to a political conference, then the government is going to try and intervene. So that distinction between public and private has been to a large degree eliminated on the continent. That's very lamentable. That's a problem. That is why there's so much unfreedom, practical unfreedom, in Africa, and why we still in South Africa have quite a bit of it, because this distinction is being jealously guarded by civil society, but is still under intense threat. And in the paper, I make the example of communal property. So Africa is a very communal place, many other places around the world as well, but there is a pre-colonial conception of property rights here. And yet somehow that is now state property in effect. If you read the 2017, I think it's the Communal Land Tenure Bill. It's a very good bill in general. It kind of moves in the direction of recognizing community associations as the owner of communal property, but it still has this kind of backdoor built in. Like, if the community wants to sell that property, it needs the government's permission to sell the property. I mean, my goodness, that's ridiculous. So there is still this lingering but very endearing identification in Africa of communality with the state, the Western Westphalian state. Somehow that is just accepted. We engage, like on X and like in debates and on radio and so on, with people when they talk about, no, you're trying to impose a Western conception of property. We don't want that. We want a communal African conception of property. What they're actually saying is, we want a Western Marxist communist conception of property in this country, which is a problem. And that is all towards the end of eliminating this crucial distinction between public and private. And that distinction exists everywhere, and it should exist everywhere. There's nothing in, if you read Zake's excellent work on this, there is nothing in kind of African thought that creates the impression that it must be a totalitarian fascist regime where the state is life. I mean, it's just not present. But we are being convinced, and we're being gaslighted that no, it must all ultimately just be the state, and that even if you call something your private property, actually, in fact, it must still be subject to the state's veto. And we at the Free Market Foundation, certainly others who join us on Rational Standard, we have a completely different take on that. Your property must be your castle, it must be your domain. And only under those very severely circumscribed circumstances can that be violated. If someone sees you beating up your wife on your property, yes, then they can run over the threshold and come and beat you up. If someone sees you lobbing grenades from your property into your neighbor's yard, yes, then the state can come into your property and set that right. But these are the exceptional cases that are very well defined in property theory itself, not in kind of the statism, but in property theory itself. There's that provision for when, under what strict circumstances that could happen. And yes, we see in Africa what the end result is of not being jealously guarded of this almost sovereignty, this intrastate sovereignty that each property owner must jealously guard. So we must just keep at it.
Yeah, and I think that point around the connection between property rights and civil liberties is something that we should be really concerned about. And yeah, I think when you give the state power and control over your property, you give them a lever to be able to control you. And I think that, one of the discussions we had during the Liberty Forum was around Bitcoin. There was a panel on the second day. And one of the speakers, he was, I won't mention who he was, but he's the leader of a think tank in his country, and he said that they'd been doing a lot of fundraising and activism, trying to raise awareness around the kind of liberal policy agenda. And one of the things that they did was, in the anticipation of an election that was coming up in this chap's country, they did some training with police and security officials around election monitoring and how do you ensure that the elections are free and fair and so on. And word got out to the president of this country that this training had happened, and very swiftly, because the president didn't like the idea of this, this think tank was effectively had all of their funds in their bank account frozen, and money is a form of property, and they couldn't pay their staff. They couldn't, they couldn't conduct their work at all. So their organization ground to a halt. And so that's a control over your property is the ability to censor speech that you don't like. So I mean, there's so many other parallels. I mean, I think there's a big debate around gun ownership. Being able to defend your property and to have some amount of coercive force is also a way to check government excess and abuse of power as well. If you think of the founding of the United States, 1776, a lot of that was because of the diffusion of arms throughout that society, and that's why is it the Second Amendment is with regards to gun ownership. So I think there are a lot of links and parallels with other rights that private property gives you. Zex, do you have any last comments on this before we chat a bit more about the Liberty Forum?
Yeah. Really, just to echo both of yours point, particularly the Martin made a pretty cool ass point as an anarchist. Probably one day when I write the definitive book against the Westphalian state, I will expand more on it. But really, the equating of the communal or the communitarian with the status, that is specifically the Westphalian status, and all of the excesses that come with all of that, that is something that is pretty unfortunate. It is quite unfortunate. If one actually looks at how pre-colonial Africa was structured, one gets the idea that Martin mentions, that your property is your domain. Your property, you are sovereign over whatever stretch of land, and actually the sovereign gets to consult you about your sovereignty, at least as it concerns things like the property that you own or the confines thereof. And that unfortunately has been lost. And when the Westphalian state was enacted, it was enacted in a very violent manner, and it appropriated everything. And it is unfortunate that in the pursuit of justice, they think that going back to this appropriation of everything, or like sticking with it in some instances, the appropriation of everything is the way to go. And that is simply just not the way to go. Ownership for the purposes that even David has mentioned, beyond really the principle of it, the practical implications thereof are pretty much telling, right? If I know that the state cannot take my property, I can host an anarchist association in my property, and we openly discuss how the state ought to cease to exist, right? And that is something that people should be able to do, although I don't know about the questionable crimes of sedition and treason, but that is a topic for another day. But either way, that is and the ability to freely associate, the ability to freely express oneself, the ability to trade, especially as the Freemacher Foundation, we should know, is intimately tied with the ability to own whatever, not only yourself, but whatever it is that you combine your actions with. And this is something that the principle thereof is what is being fought against. I think people should get that like a lot of these African governments, as you say, they don't like that. They don't like, or the people in control of these governments, they don't like not having to tell people how to live their lives, not being in the middle, being a third party to someone's life at all times, right? This paternal instinct, if we were to still man their position, really, of wanting to protect everyone, even though everyone is more than capable of protecting themselves. And when you look at the consequences thereof, it's like, man, this beautiful place can only prosper if you allow the people within it to like truly do whatever they think is best for their prosperity, and you'll see they will figure it out. And if they don't, we can work it out. I guess that's the whole point of life. But I think the embracing of liberty, why it's so appealing to me, is because of that, because I earnestly believe in the power of people to solve stuff, and I think that especially African people to solve stuff. And I think if we just unleash them, and firstly, just don't take their stuff, right? That is what you're fighting against. Let people keep their stuff. Let that power not be given to any politician, even the most well-intentioned angel out there. And prosperity will surely follow, because that is what at least I personally want to see for this place we all call home.
Yeah, and Zakes, I think, I don't know about you, but I found something really striking about the Africa Liberty Forum in Nairobi was just, you do kind of take your freedoms for granted. I mean, I think South Africa does have a lot of problems and a lot of infringements on liberty, as we discuss every week on this pod. But we also have a bit of a better situation than a lot of other African countries, right? And something that South Africa has in its favor is a tradition of the rule of law. I mean, often observed in the breach, but we have fairly independent court system. Again, that's under strain. It's often ideologically captured and so on. But we have private property under threat, but must be defended, and is a bulwark against state action, and also a culture of free speech, of challenging government power. And we've had censorship in South Africa in the past, but I think even despite that, there's been a kind of an irreverence that South Africans have towards their political leaders, and I think that's a good quality. There's unfortunately a lot of fear that many of our compatriots have in other countries who are fighting for liberty, that if they say the wrong thing about their political leaders, they might end up in jail, and we should avoid that fate. But yeah, I mean, I think also if you consider countries like Kenya, like Nigeria, I mean, these are highly plural societies, right? And often the state apparatus that they inherited from the colonial systems have just been reproduced. And I don't think that we are big fans of Frantz Fanon, but one of the things that he argued was that ultimately these anti-colonial movements are led by the bourgeois intellectuals who basically can't think outside of the kind of Western hegemonic Westphalian kind of state framework, and they capture that bureaucracy, and then that they use that bureaucracy to further their own interests. What do you think about that, Zakes?
Yeah, I mean, we aren't fans of Frantz Fanon indeed, but we are fans of good insights, though, good observations, and that was a good observation, an unfortunate one, right? And we find the reproduction of Westphalian, particularly state systems, has been unfortunate. It even gets to absurd levels, right? In certain countries where they even reproduce the wearing of white wigs. At least I personally find it to be at an absurd level in countries like Nigeria, and it is unfortunate, really, to see something like that, because it shows a lack of imagination, maybe a lack of proper belief, man. Like, this deserves an entire pod episode by its own self, right? Because it stems from the problems really that emanated from partly the anti-colonial struggle, as you mentioned, Frantz Fanon, because he was also involved in that, at least in Algeria. And as such, the problems that stem from that tend to influence really a lot of what still persists, or the ideas that still persist in a lot of African mainstream political thought, right? So the idea of, nationalism and nationhood as understood by a lot of liberation struggle leaders, and liberation leaders included, necessitated, I guess, on their parts, a amalgamation of groups that were previously not nations, right? And now they could not move past that. They could not move beyond that. This is why things like secession is anathema in Africa. It is unfortunate. By the way, I love Nigeria. It's unfortunate. I will keep on mentioning it because I find the people there, especially the equal culture, to be pretty great. But this is why you have instances like the Biafran War, right? And how vehemently the Nigerian state fought against Biafra as a state, and it led to Biafra no longer existing anymore, unfortunately. And you see also in Rwanda, right, the extent of this amalgamation of groups that were not originally amalgamated into one jurisdiction, and now, even though one would say that they have solved the problem, but as David once mentioned that other day, the dissidents aren't allowed to speak. So how best do we know really whether the problem has been solved? Because they will get eliminated soon in a hotel somewhere in Sandton. So the problems really that stem from the Westphalian states, right? And how African politicians continue to embrace it cannot be overstated, because fundamentally a lot of our problems come from refusing to think outside of this box, as Franz Fanon said, when like so many possibilities exist outside of it. And not only for that, really prosperity exists outside of it, because fundamentally these states, like these, intellectuals and the people who run them always lean towards interventionism, right? You look at even the United States, arguably probably the most free state we have seen in the history of the world, really, or in that we can recall to in recorded history, right? And even it has crept increasingly towards being more interventionist. Fortunately enough, they have a culture there of, having personal liberty and things like that. So they can have waves about they fight against the interventionist nature thereof. But overall, right, if you were to even have the US founders look at modern day America, they'd probably be like, man, our grandchildren are now socialists. When I go a better term, but you look at the rest of the world, it is much more worse, right? You look at places like Europe, the paternalism of the state. So really, I don't think that it is a trend that I want Africa to follow, but unfortunately, right, in most cases are not. A lot of African nations get their cues from that, and it usually devolves towards, an elimination of liberty and, people's rights really to just be themselves, and, the consequences of that. Even though I don't like them a lot, they're making consequential arguments that they are important, and because we are dealing with them in Africa through our poverty levels and things like that. This unwillingness to let go of the state when it has caused so much problems. To me, it is baffling, right? Like one would think that if there's a place where the Westphalian state would not be embraced, even at a theoretical level, it would be the African continent, given the amount of problems it has caused. But we like our intellectuals at the very least, and the people who vote for them, love the Westphalian state down. They want to expand it. They wanted to eliminate, as Martin would say, the private domain. They want everything to just be state and, and nothing else. And that is pretty unfortunate. So yeah. In other African states, it is even much worse, David. I made a friend when I was in Kenya, and we keep on making fun of his president, and he keeps on telling me that he may be potentially bugged, so I should be careful. And I'm like, man, the idea of that to me is unfathomable, primarily because our intelligence services are incompetent. I don't think they'll be able to bug me even if they tried. But the fact that the state would want to do something like that, I appreciate. For all the problems that I've listed right now, I appreciate the liberties that we have in South Africa. Things can always get worse, as I always say. And you tend to see that when you talk to a lot of people who are like, oh man, I can't, I have to be careful in case I'll be, abducted, and I'll turn up 3 months later. I'll be like, oof, man, that is unfathomable to me. Thankfully enough. So yeah, appreciate liberty. Even though things are bad, they can always get worse. And yeah, other African states will teach you that.
Yeah, I mean, we released in conjunction with the Fraser Institute in Canada, the Economic Freedom of the World Index, which ranks 165 countries according to levels of economic freedom. And even if South Africa became number one in economic freedom worldwide, we would still do the work that we do, because we want to vigorously defend those liberties. But yeah, Zex, I mean, I was just thinking about your comments there, and it's kind of an interesting paradoxical situation in Africa, because on the one hand, you have these quite tyrannical governments, but then also the state in many African countries is very weak at the same time. They don't have very much revenue generating capabilities, which is why they tend to have high tariffs and things. And then also a lot of corruption amongst the officialdom, because they're not really generating revenue from a kind of traditional tax base, so to speak. And so, yeah, if you look abroad, I mean, particularly during COVID, for example, a lot of these established Western democracies really weaponized state power to infringe on liberties quite extensively. I mean, one of the most chilling anecdotes I remember was, there was a woman, I think in Australia, and she was saying I can't remember where she was based, but during the lockdowns, she was kind of stuck in Victoria and needed to get to New South Wales or something like that. And she kind of expressed, on Facebook, like, oh, this is really concerning. I don't know what I'm going to do. I might have to just drive in the middle of the night, to avoid. And then people like ratted on her and said, hey, Australian government, you might want to do something about this. And then, next thing she gets kind of a knock on the door to say, like, you're in violation of lockdown protocols, something like that. I might have my memory a bit scrambled there, but and then in Canada again, there were these trucker protests, so against the vaccine mandates, where truckers who were bringing goods from the United States back into Canada and vice versa, they weren't allowed to re-enter Canada without a vaccine passport. And a lot of them were saying, "Oh, listen, for health reasons, I don't want to get a vaccine," or just conscientious objection. And so the government basically said, well, get stuffed. And then when they launched protests and were crowdfunding for these protests, for these trucker convoys that were going to Ottawa, then they too had their funds frozen by the Trudeau government, ostensibly under anti-terrorist activities and laws. So, it's not just kind of African tin pot dictators who are seizing the assets of dissident groups. It's also established liberal democracies, so-called liberal democracies. Martin, you were not with us in Nairobi, but what do you think is the state of liberty in Africa, and particularly, given the kind of plural nature of many of these societies? I think Africa, in a way, has an opportunity to kind of forge a bit of a new or a different kinds of governance model, that's more maybe akin to its own kind of cultural makeup. And, I think, we definitely are universalists in terms of the rights of man to own and to express themselves and to trade with one another. But I wouldn't say that we're universalists in terms of imposing a governance structure, that there should be one way of governing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no. So I think just to grab onto a point you just made about the West, and I think this ties into your question. So I think there's a lot of evidence to back this up, that there is a kind of a backtracking of freedom around the world for the moment. There was a time in the 1990s, 2000s, when kind of economic freedom and individual freedom was kind of an ascendant feature of politics, and the FMF was very kind of excited about this, and we often pointed it out. But if you look at the Cato Institute's Human Freedom Index over the last couple of years, and the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World Index, they note that actually things are now turning in the other direction. And it's we as liberals are kind of on our own again. We're very used to being on our own, so this is not a tragedy at all. But our old allies, what you could call kind of maybe the new right and so on, have also developed something of a distaste for our conception of individual freedom, and also community freedom and so forth, and private property. Yeah, kind of this is manifested in the Western post-liberal way of thought, very much a paternalistic in economics as well. It always used to be, yeah, well, the conservatives are capitalists, but they don't agree with us on social issues. No, they are now also not capitalists, and they don't agree with us on social issues. So, and they and the left have kind of taken hands on this. They have very different vibes, so they still fight a lot amongst themselves, but they do agree on the undesirability of freedom. Now, my hypothesis has always been that any setback for freedom is always temporary. So I don't let it get me down, and I'm like, oh God, freedom is kind of on the back foot. I think there is something intrinsic about kind of liberal individual liberty that every human has somewhere in their mind, and when things get bad enough, kind of liberalism bursts onto the scene, because it's always going to be the most obvious answer to solve a political impasse. We saw this at the end of apartheid. Black African nationalists, communists coming together with white Afrikaner nationalist authoritarians, not a hint of liberalism amongst them, and they still settled on a largely liberal kind of compromise. And you saw this in the post-communist states. You see this everywhere where liberalism is seen as the path of least resistance. So I always think liberalism will come back. It's going to be, to our enemies, it's going to be the cancer that you cannot excise. So that's very good for us. But we are now in that moment where we're in the heartland of freedom, the West, it is, I think, on the back foot for the moment. And I think Africa is well positioned. And I've said this on this podcast before. There was a time when I thought, well, geez, Africa is so bad, it would be good for me to kind of maybe move to the UK or to Australia or something, maybe to kind of run away from the tyranny. And in like since lockdown, when I look at the UK and Australia, I'm like, oh, I mean, maybe I'll take my chances in Africa instead. And that kind of touches on what Jake said. And I mean, yes, we can make fun of these governments as incompetent and kind of incapacitated, but that is it's such an underrated um, advantage that the advocates of freedom have on this continent, that I think we need to make far more ado about it, to say that, listen, actually the field is wide open to us. I try my best to kind of tell people in South Africa, listen, you don't have to be so despondent. The South African government is only able to impose its ideology, its authoritarian designs, to the degree that we are eagerly complying. That is it. That is it. It has no enforcement mechanism of its own, and even less so in Africa, far less so in the rest of Africa. The fear and compliance of the population, the fear and compliance of business, the fear and compliance of civil society is the defining characteristic of African authoritarianism in the 2020s. That is my kind of hypothesis on this. Whereas in the West, actually, you have to be careful because the police are coming. They could come and they could come and get you. So I think Africa is in a very good position. It's an open opportunity that is lying there waiting for someone to grab it, and grabbing it needs to happen. So it's not like freedom is going to materialize itself for us. Work has to be done. I just think the work that we in Africa have to do is less than the work that our colleagues in the West have to do, because they have to fight against a very conscious turn against liberty. Whereas in Africa, you don't see that kind of African political, let's say, culture and kind of events is indistinguishable today, I would say, from 10 years ago, from 20 years ago, from 30 years ago, from 40 years ago. It's the same thing. There's nothing new that we have to respond to. It's the same old, very weak anti-freedom sentiment that, as we do in our writing, me and Jake's particularly, is often just to say, listen, you cannot accuse us of being cultural imperialists. It is you, the enemies of freedom in Africa, who are actually blowing sunshine up the West's bottom with your worshipping of authoritarian Western statism, and that is almost as simple as our job is on the African continent. It's more difficult elsewhere. So I am an optimist when it comes to Africa. I'm a bit of a pessimist about people taking the opportunity. I grow quite despondent about inaction in very obvious areas. Kind of take BE for example, the almost giddy, gleeful compliance, even in cases where it's not even strictly legally required to comply, but you see this giddy and gleeful compliance by ordinary South Africans, and then you go and you say, hey, do you know you don't have to do this, and they're like, oh wow, really? No, you can't be serious. Like, just this kind of unconsciousness, with which people who otherwise would claim to care about freedom move through life. I think that is our big problem. I mean, apathy is our big problem. If we can surmount that, I think Africa is the best place for freedom, really. You're going to find very little resistance once you surmount the apathy mountain. So very optimistic about that. Quite pessimistic about freedom in the rest of the world. I think the United States will always be that bastion of freedom, and they have a very strong culture, as X pointed out, of resisting against these things. But even there, it's starting to show some cracks, I would say.
Yeah, I think the $37 trillion deficit that they've accumulated shows you just how hungry the state is for resources of ordinary people. But yeah, Zakes, do you have any reflections on your trip to Nairobi? Like, you were there obviously for the Ayite Society. Maybe you could tell our devoted listeners what that is and the paper that you produced. I think we'll also try and do some publicity on that paper for the FMF. But yeah, maybe just sketch some of the outlines of and also some of the other contributions that were made by some of your fellow fellows.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was cool. Firstly, the George Aita Society, right? A society that we hope will be pretty much uh, one of the foundations or one of the homes, the engines that produces liberal ideas in the broader African continent. And as such, it is a scholarly society that combines all the crazies across Africa, like myself and others. And we pretty much write about all the problems we have and, provide libertarian or liberal solutions to them. And yeah, this year I went away in Kenya. It's always great, right? Because these are opportunities for me to travel outside of SA, get to go to other countries and meet new people. I might not look it, but people find it weirdly easy to talk to me. So I always meet people every time I travel. As I said, I've made quite a few friends. So yeah, that was cool. That was cool. The meeting was great. I, got an opportunity to have a physical copy of a paper I submitted last year, which was the first, I think, inaugural in-person meeting for the society, and that was pretty cool. I am still fascinated by seeing my name on a byline next to some pretty cool ass ideas, I would add.
Who was George Aite, Zakes?
Okay. I assume that, like, if you watch us, you ought to know one of the greatest African economists, if not the greatest African economist ever. But George Aite was an economics professor from Ghana originally, and he was great. He wrote extensively about, firstly, pre-colonial African institutions, how they do not lend themselves automatically to socialism. Did a whole lot of research on pre-colonial political and economic institutions, and more specifically, he wrote about modern economic theory, pretty much arguing for free markets in an African context and how much Africa needs to adopt a an approach that we argue for all the time here at the Free Market Foundation. And he was saying that he was great is an understatement. You don't find a lot of African thinkers like him. He was grounded a lot in in a perspective that I try to ground myself a lot in, in premising his arguments for liberty from an African, I want to say, socio-cultural foundation. And I think he did that extremely well. He was extremely well read. His book, Pre-Colonial African Institutions, is one of the best books you can really find if you can, get your hands on it. It is amazing. He was great. He argued for liberty, argued against the tyrants in Africa, most especially, for me, I am a philosophy head when I'm wearing my other hats, and in philosophy specifically, he argued against the idea on conceptions of personhood, which is what I wrote my paper on. A very nice segue this one is. But yeah, I argued on conceptions of personhood and how those conceptions of personhood that exist in Africa do not lend themselves to, what would be called really socialism and communism, as a lot of, liberation movements and liberation anti-colonial thinkers thought, people like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, who argued that, his Ujamaa was an adoption pretty much of African principles, and that was really socialism, rank and file, Marxist-Leninist socialism, and the collectivization of people's farms and things like that, and all the horrible consequences, of course, that created for the people in that jurisdiction. So George Aite is a guy who argues against stuff like that. that unfortunately he has, no longer in the land of the living. And as such, the society that I am pretty proud to be part of is named after him. At least I'm proud because it is named after a man I consider one of the greatest thinkers that we've seen really in 20th century Africa. Someone who presented actionable solutions that I hope that we follow. But yeah, I contributed a paper. It is on conceptions of personhood, very philosophical paper. I pretty much argue that how Africans really conceive of the person and their existence within their social systems that they may be in does not necessarily translate to an elimination of individual liberty or individual essence, for lack of a better term, and by extension does not translate to an elimination or a negation of property rights, private property rights, private rights, really individual liberties, and most especially does not support the institution of things like socialism or general states or command economies whereby the state wants to own everything and tell people what to do. So yeah, quite a philosophical paper. Hopefully you read it. I hope that you get to enjoy it. And yeah, because I enjoyed writing it. It is something that I am extremely proud of. It has been multiple years in the working. I first really wrote the ideas about it somewhat when I was all the way back in university, and then I expanded on them in this paper, and hopefully one day they will translate to an actual book, because there's so much more that I could have said. But yeah, I'm proud of it because it argues for liberty, individual liberty, life, liberty, and property in the Bashiat sense within an African, conception, within an African grounding, which is something that I am pretty proud of, a philosophy of mine, if so. So yeah.
Wow, that's very cool, Zax. Thanks, man.
Cool.
Yeah, so I was there speaking on a panel around securing property rights in Africa, which we've spoken about extensively today. But yeah, it was an interesting opportunity and also a good moment to just reflect on the Kaya Lum project, which the Free Market Foundation has been running since 2010. And yeah, I took the opportunity to brag about some of our successes of securing freehold title in South Africa, 20,000 title deeds that we've assisted in transferring from municipalities to worthy beneficiaries, former tenants of council-owned properties. And in the 90s, the council divested themselves of these properties. And yeah, I think that that's kind of an unusual initiative for a think tank. And in between our philosophical discourses on the notion of personhood and on the notion of personhood and our kind of fervent defense of liberty, we also, I think, very proud of the fact that we've made a meaningful difference in those people's lives. I think one of the points I tried to make on the panel, and there were some really good contributions from Rejoice Ngwenya from Zimbabwe, and Loxane from Burundi, and Evans from Uganda, was just that, there are all sorts of economic benefits to private property rights, like being able to gain collateral for a loan from a bank, for example, or intergenerational wealth transfer, that gives you long-term security of tenure, and you can invest in that property and upgrade it, and it gives you a form of capital preservation, and these are all very important economic benefits. But there's also this recognition of the human side of it, that people have a fundamental right of ownership, and nobody should be denied that. And so, yeah, that's always a point that I try and make, that even if there were no economic benefits, we would still do this project. And yeah, needless to say, we're really grateful to the many donors who've supported this project over the years. And yeah, when we host these title deed handover ceremonies, they're very joyous affairs, and often the beneficiaries are quite senior, quite they're in their 80s or even 90s. I think we've had some beneficiaries that have been what would the term be, centenarians. They're over 100 years old, And, to the point that I've just been making, like sometimes a journalist will ask, well, you've got tears running down your cheeks. Why are you so happy that you're receiving this title deed? And they say, well, now I can die knowing that my children will have security and control over the home that we've lived in as a family for generations. And, that peace of mind, that comfort is what private property rights brings. It's not just the roof over your head. Like, everybody needs shelter, but as I often remind people, like in the Soviet Union, everybody had shelter, right? Like, you lived in these big concrete housing blocks, but if the state wanted to move you around or change your location or something, they would just do so on a whim. The same for communist China and so on. So yeah, I think it was just a good moment to kind of reflect on also South Africa relative to other countries. Rejoice from Zimbabwe, they had a truly horrific experience with erosion of private property rights there, and that had calamitous consequences for that economy in Zimbabwe. So a cautionary tale again. Just as a bit of a sidebar, I always find it kind of weird how in South Africa we like to kind of think that we're exceptional, that what happened in Zimbabwe could never happen here. It's like, oh no, Zimbabwe, they're just like our kind of poor cousins north of the Limpopo. Like, we would never experience that kind of deprivation here. And yes, we do have these alternative poles of power, but I think we would be foolish not to heed the lesson from Zimbabwe and push back aggressively on those developments that are pushing us in that direction. Gentlemen, I think I've said all that I needed to say on this topic, but are there any closing remarks from you guys? Martin?
Yeah.
We haven't heard from you in a bit.
Oh yeah, we haven't heard from Martin in a while. I just wanted to add on your points about Zimbabwe. I was just watching a video of this economist. I've always follow people specifically who argue for MMT or for the expansion of our monetary supply because they are inflationary. But there was an economist who was speaking on the news, and he was arguing about how he does not like the fact that the Reserve Bank decreased its inflation range. I think it was from 3 to 5. It is now from 3 to 4, aiming for a lower inflation target, which would of course impact the amount, but the rate at which they decrease rates and things like that. And he was unhappy about this, and he was arguing for a political, mandate for the Reserve Bank, that it should not only focus on protecting the value of the currency, which it does a poor job of, but it should focus on other things too, like unemployment and the rest. And it struck me because you mentioned Zimbabwe, and one of the problems that Zimbabwe, beyond their lack of protection for private property rights, is that they're a textbook case of, with all the things that Austrian economists talk about when you expand the monetary supply, right, and it causes inflation, and how their central bank has still not been able to arrest that situation. Even to this day, they have tried multiple, alternatives, and Zimbabweans have just, devolved to using the US greenback because that is the most stable form of exchange, or at least medium of exchange that they can rely on, right? And to me, what your point is correct. Things can always get worse. So yeah, that Zimbabwe issue just reminded me of how we also have people arguing for the same policy positions that causes Zimbabwe to have hyperinflation, and they're like, oh no, but let the Reserve Bank solve unemployment, because that's what happens. Monetary policy addresses a governmental policy issue that usually ends up in a very, very good place. So yeah, things can always get worse.
Yeah, there's a kind of a flawed assumption that state action will be somehow much more rational and more considered and exempt from all of the flaws of human nature, and that there'll be no special interests lobbying the government to weaponize that power in favor of those interests or against another interest. And like we were joking about the $36 or $37 trillion deficit of the US federal government. And I mean, it's very hard to stop that train once it's moving, and I think that's why we always err on the side of freedom, and some accuse us of maybe being a bit alarmist sometimes. But the alarmism is there for a reason, because you make these kind of supposedly pragmatic concessions like, okay, we're going through a financial crisis. Let's just turn on the monetary taps let's utilize the central bank to print a whole lot of money just for now, just as an emergency measure, just to get us through this rough patch. And then, not even a decade later, you look back and you think, oh my goodness, like how did we debase our currency and, create all sorts of systemic problems in our economy. But it's because, you thought that you could control circumstances perfectly through these actions. And I think that's the wisdom of Friedrich Hayek. There's a kind of humility to that. An acceptance that there's an emergent order to economic affairs, and that people acting in their own interests often do actually create beneficial outcomes. And sometimes you might think you're correcting for a problem, but you're actually creating a whole lot of other new problems that are even more difficult to solve. Martin, any last thoughts from you before we close the pod?
Yeah, certainly. So I mean, that thing about it can't happen here is so crucially important. So what I said earlier still applies. We have the benefit of Africa having a very in general, African states having very lax kind of political enforcement mechanisms, and thank goodness for that, and that applies in South Africa. But that it cannot get worse is, and I always make the point that I reject Godwin's law. Those of you who are familiar with what Godwin's law is, like you're not allowed to bring Nazi Germany into it. But as someone who my idea of relaxing reading, the reading that I do for fun rather than kind of for work, is reading about history. And for me, if you're not allowed to learn from history, then I think you're playing a dangerous game. That is what history's utility is in the world, and that's to learn lessons. And the book I just finished reading, it's a Finn book. It's part of a series from Time Life in the 1990s, and this is one of the editions in that series, and it's called The Apparatus of Death in the Third Reich series. And
this is your light bedside reading, eh?
This is my light reading, and I enjoy this because it's a very graphic, no holds barred series. So colored images, and you see they point out where the concentration camps are, and they show kind of what the Nazis did to the gypsies and so on. So I appreciate it for being a very graphic book, and that's the way I enjoy engaging with history. Like, you can read a lot of kind of pop history nowadays about the Nazis were so bad and like millions of people died. This book got into the details, and that's kind of a long roundabout way of saying that there's a part in this book where they spoke about Jews who fled anti-Semitism from Eastern Europe. And where did they flee in the 1920s and 30s? They fled into Germany. This was like Hitler was around in those days. But the Jews, and they quote a few Jewish leaders, they said that the German culture will never allow the anti-Semitism that we experienced in the East to kind of occur here. This is a sophisticated, though kind of struggling, Western bastion of decency and so on. So we're fleeing to Germany. It cannot happen here. So that's one part. The other part is in the early 1940s, when the Wehrmacht was already kind of marching into Russia, into the Soviet Union. Jewish citizens in Soviet towns celebrated the arrival of the Wehrmacht. They celebrated the arrival of the SS. They didn't know what was happening in Germany, but they celebrated because for so long they have been kind of discriminated against under the Soviet Union. So they said, the Germans are here, finally. That great civilization that we've read about in the history books, they are here. We are liberated from the communist jackboot. And what happened? Those towns were completely destroyed. Like, not one Jew left in many of those towns. So no, it can get worse. Even if you think that you live in a society that is civilized, decent, the kind of circumstances just have to line up in a way that is not very conducive to kind of sensible civility, that things can go very, very badly. I don't think South Africa is anywhere close to that, but if this apathy that we are I would say, increasingly encouraging. Like you're my colleagues at the FMF, you'll know that I despise the kind of race to the bottom of attention spans. Like if a video is longer than 2.5 minutes, then it's too long and people aren't interested. And if an article isn't only 340 words and it's too long and people click off, it's this apathy, this desire to just maximize time, kind of a very high time preference. If we further encourage that and people just disengage from kind of what is happening, then we're begging for things to get worse. We're actually asking for it. So no, things can get worse, but we have a benefit in Africa of organized politics being very weak, and the answer to that is that if you organize as civil society, as liberal, as people who care about freedom, victory is virtually guaranteed. And that is something I think we can take a lot of solace in, but it does mean we have to do some work. And then just as a final word, the research that Zakes did on African personhood is crucial. This is stuff that is not seen in the discourse, and it defines so much of the public policy that we get. Kind of, you read about Ubuntu and so on in the judgments of the courts, where they say let's nationalize all the property. They say, but it's Ubuntu. Ubuntu requires us to do this. So nationalization, socialism in policy in South Africa is justified by a problematic conception of what is the social, what is a person in society. So yeah, I just want to kind of figuratively take my hat off to Zake's very crucial stuff. I really enjoyed your essay, and I look forward to more.
Yeah, well done, Zakes. And yeah, we've been quoting some of our intellectual opponents today. First, Frans Fanon, but there's also a good quote by Hegel. The only thing that we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history, he said. And yeah, I think that's something to heed. And yeah, Martin, thanks for proving Godwin's law correct, that all debates eventually degenerate into an analogy towards Nazi Germany.
As they must.
But yeah, so thank you, gentlemen. That was really stimulating and really interesting. And yeah, I think as a way to close, I'll just say that to our African brothers and sisters on the continent fighting for liberty, we salute you. You're up against often incredible odds, and we are standing by your side, keeping the flame of liberty alive in this continent. And yeah, it's, I think, worthy of a lifetime of effort and commitment. These principles are more than just about political preferences or some kind of economic model. It's about our lives as human beings on this earth. And so much love from the Free Market Foundation down in the southern part of Africa. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. And thanks to our audience. All of the customary suffixes apply. So go and hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, check out rationalstandard.com, and yeah, follow us on Substack and restack us and all that stuff. And yeah, please engage if you're watching this after the stream has ended. Yeah, let us know your thoughts in the comments. What do you think is the state of freedom in Africa? How do we enhance liberty and free individuals in Africa? Let us know your thoughts. All right, cool, guys. Have a great weekend.